This is a short introduction to assessments. Here are some key concepts underlying all the assessments. First, let's talk about the evaluation and selection of psychological tests. You need to consider the examiner's qualifications. There's a 3-tier system for categorizing them. And then you need to consider the examinee and all of the different aspects, including their culture and any developmental or disabilities. And then you need to consider the match between the examiner and the examinee. Another factor in choosing an assessment is what the test characteristics are. Is there a match between the purpose of the test and the reason for the assessment? Reliability and validity are essential to consider, and reliability lets you know the test can work to measure free of error, and validity is it actually measuring what you want it to measure. Standardization is key, and there's 2 characteristics here. First, the testee's words and acts and all of that have been collected at different times so that even then they are fully comparable. And second, this test was standardized with a norm group. And the closer to the norm group your examinee is, the more valid. Different types of scores. Norms compare the examinee to the norm group. Criterion is really looking at what the examinee knows or doesn't know compared to a content or performance area. And self-reference are like ipsative scales. It permits intra-individual comparison, like looking at different subscales and how they compare, and verbal versus math. Here's an example of norm. Percentage correct is criterion, and norm you can see on this bell curve. Objective tests and subjective. This is normative versus ipsative, comparing to others versus comparing to the self. What about types of psychological assessment? We will look at a few. Behavioral assessment, you look at overt and covert behaviors. You can use techniques like interviews, observations, protocol analysis, even physiological things. And a specific type is the functional behavioral assessment, and you identify an undesirable behavior and what antecedents and consequences are allowing it to continue, and then you alter them. Dynamic assessment is kind of based on Vygotsky, and it's when you want to see if someone could actually benefit from extra help. One example of this is testing the limits. After you give something in standardized form, you give them extra cues to see if they can go a little bit further with assistance. Computer-assisted assessment should not be used to replace clinical judgment, but it has the benefit of allowing subsequent items to be based on previous answers. And how do you make decisions in terms of the assessment? There's 2 kinds. There's statistical predictions, and then there's clinical, which is what the clinician decides based on their experience. And the actuarial, basically the empirical predictions, have been shown to be more accurate alone than clinical alone. Also important to think about how to assess specific populations. With kids, it's important to use descriptive statements, reflection, provide labeled praise, like you're doing a good job, and to avoid critical statements. Another useful strategy is using open-ended questions, but something like why should be avoided generally. And finally, anatomically correct dolls can be helpful. There's no widely acceptable standards for using them, though. When you assess a member of a culturally diverse population, it's really important to think about the cultural equivalence of the content or construct measured by the test, and if there are any alternatives available, more appropriate. Think about the purpose, be clear about it. There are no culture fair tests. Use as culturally sensitive, though, as you can, and be aware of normative behavior when people respond for their culture. And finally, self-monitor your level of expertise with respect to different groups. Researchers interested in intelligence have proposed a number of theories of intelligence and evaluated its stability over the lifespan. There are a number of theories of intelligence that we'll briefly review. Spearman proposed that there is a general intellectual factor, G. Any performance depends on G plus other factors unique to the task. Some propose there are problems with Spearman's G factor. Thurston was the first to criticize Spearman and set the stage for an idea of multiple forms of intelligence. Horn and Cattell came up with the idea of crystallized and fluid intelligence. Crystallized is acquired knowledge and skills and can be impacted by the environment and learning, whereas fluid doesn't depend on instruction, is culture-free, and enables an individual to solve novel problems and perceive relations and similarities. Then along came Carroll in 1997 to distinguish 3 levels or strata of intelligence. The third at the top is general, G. The second has 8 broad abilities that include fluid and crystallized and general memory and learning. And then finally, the first stratum is specific abilities tied to each of the second. McGrew, partnering with Cattell-horn-carroll in 1997, combined this approach to derive the CHC model. And this was developed on the basis of empirical research. It serves as the framework for the KBC2 and Woodcock-Johnson. And he comes up with 7 narrow stratum abilities within 10 broad. Guilford structure of intellect model distinguishes between convergent and divergent thinking. Convergent relies on rational and logic to come up with the correct solution, and divergent involves non-logical processes and requires creativity and flexibility to derive multiple solutions. Sternberg's triarchic theory, he defines successful intelligence as the ability to adapt to, modify, and choose environments that accomplish one's goals and the goals of society. Sternberg proposed 3 abilities: analytical, creative, and practical. Intelligence tests focus on analytical but ignore the others. Gardner thought the traditional view was too narrow and distinguished between 8 types that include music, nature, and spatial and body. Gardner had the goal that people understand the world in terms of its fascination and tried to extend to other cultures. Part of his approach was based on a survey of prodigies and autistic children and found that there was a jagged cognitive profile inconsistent with other models of intelligence. And of course, we always come to the question of what is the result of nature and what is the result of nurture. And of course, here you find that there's some of both. The role of heredity is fairly large, and the impact can be expressed in terms of a heritability estimate, which indicates the proportion of variability in intelligence due to inherited factors. Most correlations in industrialized countries is between 0.6 to 0.8, which is about 1/3 to 2/3 variability. The environment as well has impact, and you can talk about the confluence model, which talks about the relationship between family, size, order, etc., where the oldest has the highest IQ. And then the Flynn effect, which says that there's actually been an increase of at least 3 IQ points per decade, which speaks to the fact that there are environmental factors. This has recently stopped or reversed in some countries. And is it stable over the lifespan? Well, there's some differences that happen in aging, but they become fairly consistent after age 7. So in terms of fluid and crystallized, the basic theory is that crystallized increases until 60 and fluid peaks in adolescence and declines thereafter. They say that this is due to deficiencies in working memory that have been attributed to declines in processing speed. The Saddle longitudinal study used a cross-sequential design, so they combined cross-sectional and longitudinal methodologies. They found these age-related declines were not so accurate, and they thought that was because if you use a cross-sectional design, at any given time, younger people are better educated than older people. For most people, only perceptual speed declined substantially prior to 60. What are factors related? Well, really just efficiency and speed with which one manipulates information. Cardiovascular functioning has an impact on information processing speed, and so also has an impact on cognitive abilities. They also think that some of this is just due to disuse, and training and practice can reverse the changes. And what about group differences? They have found differences in terms of gender, ethnicity, and race with different reasons for that. In terms of gender, the moral of the story is there are very small differences that are found, and they have been declining in recent years. Then in terms of ethnicity and race, whites tend to outperform African Americans by about 1 standard deviation on the Stanford-Binet and other tests, and the gap has narrowed since the 70s. But what's essential to know here is the idea of 2 different kinds of bias. Slope means there's differential validity. The validity coefficients differ for different groups. It's more accurate for one group than another. Intercept is, hey, it's an accurate test, but it's unfair because even though it's accurate, means on the predictor differ, even though the criterion does not. So researchers interested in intelligence have also had to come up with a way to test for them. There are a number of different kinds of tests, the most common being Stanford-Binet and the WAIS. So Stanford-Binet and the WAIS, you need to look at how they're administered and what the different subscales are. Okay, so Stanford-Binet. The age range is divided into verbal and nonverbal domains that measure the same 5 cognitive factors. There are 5 main cognitive as seen in the chart. Fluid intelligence, knowledge, quantitative, it is tailored to the examinee's level of cognitive functioning through the use of routing and functional subtests. In each one, there administration begins with the 2 routing subtests, the object series matrices, which is nonverbal, and vocabulary, which is verbal. And the starting point of these subtests is based on the examinee's age or estimated ability level. Administration of each of the functional subtests begins at a level slightly below their ability as determined by their performance on the routing subtest. Testing for each subtest continues until the examinee reaches their ceiling, which is determined by the designated number of consecutive errors. Scoring and interpretation is also important to know. This can be hand-scored or scored using computer software. Subtest scores, mean of 10, standard deviation 3, are combined to obtain 4 types of composite scores, mean of 100, standard deviation of 15. The full scale IQ, a factor index, domain, and abbreviated battery IQ. Change-sensitive scores can also be calculated. These scores allow criterion-referenced interpretation of an examinee's performance in terms of developmental level and complexity of the task, and are useful for evaluating examinees at extreme levels of ability and for tracking changes in performance over time. So important to remember that the subtests are combined to get the full scale IQ, and then you have a factor index that includes each of the 5, domain, so then you get to look at the verbal and nonverbal, and then you can look at an abbreviated battery, which is looking at the routing subtest, actually. Psychometric properties. The standardization consisted of 4,800 people aged 2 to 96 years old, stratified to match the census in terms of gender, ethnicity, geography, socioeconomic. An additional 1,365 people represented special groups, intellectual disabilities, learning disabilities, hearing impairments, attention deficits, etc., and they were included in the sample. Internal consistency reliability coefficients for full-scale IQ, nonverbal, verbal, and factor indexes are all above 0.9, while coefficients for the subtest ranging from 0.84 to 0.89. Evidence for the test content, criterion-related, factorial, and consequential validity is provided in their technical manual. For the WAIS, the age range is 16 to 90 years old, and this is based on the idea that there's a global ability that we have with numerous interrelated functions. There are 4 indexes here. working memory, verbal comprehension, processing speed, and perceptual reasoning. So you can see that compared to the Stanford-Binet, they both have working memory. But other than that, there is no processing speed or explicitly perceptual reasoning and verbal comprehension on the Stanford-Binet. One other thing to know is just with Alzheimer's, processing speed goes down. With traumatic brain injury, the verbal is the best. And with mild dementia, there's just a slight drop in IQ. OASE has 11 subtests to measure these 4 areas, and there are 3 supplementary. So here are the 5 different areas and the different subtests that are given to assess them. For the WAIS, the standard deviation is 15 and the average is 100. And here's how they break down intelligence level. With the WAIS administration, there's a starting point, and if you obtain a 0 on the first 2 items, there's a reverse rule. There's also a point at which you discontinue administering the questions. Using computers to score, everything is converted to standardized scores. And in terms of the psychometric properties, it was there's a big correlation between the 4 and the 3. So the Wechsler Intelligence Scale is based on neurocognitive models of information processing and measures 6 of the Cattell-horn-carroll cognitive abilities. The WISC has 4 different main categories, similar to the WAIS: verbal, perceptual, working memory, and processing speed with a full scale. Important to know the score patterns for autism and ADHD on the WISC. Here you'll find with autism, it's better with things like blocks, the spatial visual matrix design, and harder with things like symbol coding. ADHD is good with the visual pictures and such, and a harder time with arithmetic and cancellation. The WISC is appropriate for ages 6 to 16, and then there's a preschool scale of intelligence for those that are younger. Number of Kaufman tests, and they are a measure of cognitive ability for kids aged 3 through 18, the KABC2. There's 5 scales there: simultaneous, sequential, planning, learning, and knowledge, also based on CHC or LOREA, neuropsychological processing. This is considered a cultural fair test of cognitive ability because it minimizes the verbal, and there you can see there's pictures here. The cognitive assessment system assesses basic cognitive skills central to learning and measures LOREA's 4 functions of planning, simultaneous, attention, and successive. This is appropriate ages 5 through basically 18. The Slosson Tests are a quick way for identifying mental ability and identifying children who are at risk. And these are appropriate for ages 2 through 7, so these are for little ones. The Woodcock-Johnson is appropriate from 2 to 90 years old, connected to the CHC model. And there's 2 different ones: cognitive abilities and achievement. And this is really about assessing strengths and weaknesses that might have to do with school, and find where there are discrepancies. Infants' tests are considered valid as screening devices for developmental delays and neurological impairment. Generally, they wouldn't be used for predicting later IQ scores. IQ isn't stable until about age 7. The Denver Developmental Screening is from birth to 6 years, and it assesses 4 domains: personal, fine motor, language, and gross motor. If you fail something 90% fail, then, or 90% pass, that's a sign of something. Bayley scales is 1 to 42 months, so about 3 or 4 years of age, toddlers. And there are 5 different tests. This incorporates more parent-caregiver interaction, and what you get is it has some direct links to what interventions are appropriate for the toddler or infant. Fagan looks at infant selective attention to novel stimuli and how much they look at pictures. This is for 1 and under, and it's really for identifying mental retardation or other cognitive impairment. What about people with physical disabilities? You have the Columbia Mental Scale for ages 3 or 4 through 9 is the first one. And we have this because of the Americans with Disabilities Act, which prohibits discrimination. And so with assessments for a job applicant or employee needs to be appropriate. So the Columbia, ages 3.5 to basically 10, this does not require verbal responses or fine motor skills. So this can be used with people that have cerebral palsy or brain damage or limited English. The Peabody. So what is the purpose of the Peabody? It is to measure receptive vocabulary and verbal intelligence. It can be used for those with motor and speech impairment from 2.5 to 90 plus. So Peabody is useful for all sorts of people. And all you have to do is be able to hear the word, and then you can indicate by pointing and such. Haptic Intelligence Scale for the adult blind. It's clear that this has to do with visual impairments, and ages 16 and older, it is appropriate, and this is about intelligence. The Hiskey, Nebraska is measuring learning ability for those with hearing and language impairments, and this is for kids 3 to 18, almost 18. So they try to come up with some tests that are culture fair. In truth, there are none that are totally culture fair, but here's a few that attempt. The Lighter International Performance is about cognitive ability. So this is if you're younger. So this is 2 to about 21. And there's 4 domains that it measures: visualization, reasoning, memory, and attention. It doesn't require verbal or written responses, so it can be useful for non-English speaking or language and hearing impairments. Raven's progressive matrices are generally considered the most multicultural test because they're independent of the effects of specific educational and cultural learning. This is meant as a nonverbal measure of general intelligence, or G factor. It's appropriate for those 6 and older, and there are different ones for preschoolers and for those who are more advanced. And finally, in terms of group tests, you have 3, the Coleman Cognitive Abilities Test and Wonderlic tests. Coleman and Cognitive Abilities Tests are for K through 12, Coleman for school learning ability, and the Cognitive Abilities is more about eligibility for a gifted program. And the Wonderlic is more about jobs. So the personnel is 12 minutes of cognitive ability to help with hiring decisions, and the basic skills is 40 minutes of job-related verbal math skills for employability at an entry-level position. Ability and interest tests are used in educational and organizational settings for many purposes. There are 6 main tests and concepts to look at. In terms of measures of academic ability, you have instructional assessment that looks at schools, tests that help identify learning disabilities, and tests to help with admission process. Instructional assessment, there are 2 kinds. Curriculum is a periodic assessment of school-age kids with standardized tests to see how good the instruction is. And performance-based is kind of the centerpiece of the Clinton administration, known as authentic assessment. And this says it's egalitarian, and it's more about your skill in carrying something out. There are 3 main tests for learning disabilities. The Illinois test of psycholinguistic ability is for ages 5 through 12, so elementary school. And this is helpful for identifying dyslexia and phonological coding problems, as well as tracking progress. Wide range achievement, also helpful with learning disabilities and monitoring progress, and that's for everybody above 5. And the Wechsler achievement assesses 8 areas that are important, and this can help with IEPs. We all know about the SAT and the GRE. These are 2 of the main admission tests that are used. In terms of aptitude tests, you have the multiple aptitude tests, and then you have occupational tests of specific aptitudes. So multiple aptitude tests rely on this idea of differential validity. In other words, the subtests and the batteries do not have different levels of validity for different groups. Verbal reasoning is highly correlated with grades in most academic courses. So the differential aptitude test includes 5 tests related to job abilities, and it assesses for intellectual abilities for grades 7 through 8. In terms of occupational tests of specific aptitudes, there's psychomotor and mechanical tests. Finally, interest inventories are essential in kind of looking at what will make someone happy in the future in terms of jobs. It's not about success, but it's more about what's a good fit. The strong interest inventory is the strong profile and the strong career test online. It has 2 approaches, occupational themes and basic interest scales. And there are 5 basic scales. General occupational themes based on Holland. Basic interest scales, there's 30 of them. Occupational scales, 122 diverse occupations. Personal style scales, and administrative indices. The Kuder Tests, the Kuder Occupational, this is for high school juniors through adults, and this doesn't have a reference group. It relies on empirical criterion keying. And here you can look at different occupational groups. So it will look at college majors, vocational interests, and dependability indexes. This is the most famous one to know about, and this is Holland's theory of career choice. It says match a person's preferences to the characteristics of the job. This is a hexagon, there's 6 different areas, and an important concept here is called differentiation and consistency. Consistency is the similarity of the 2 strongest measured interests, and differentiation is the distinctiveness of their interests. Finally, commonness is the frequency with which their summary code occurred in different groups. So if someone has low coherence, they can explore why they have so many interests and how that will impact them later on. Now we'll move into personality tests. The MMPI is certainly the most important to know about, but there's also different kinds of personality tests. First, we'll start with structured personality. These use multiple choice, self-report, and they usually use either a logical content method, theoretical, empirical criterion keying, or factor analysis, and that's like the NEO, or 16 personality factor. The MMPI was developed as a method for deriving psychiatric diagnoses. Empirical criterion keying was the strategy used. There are a number of clinical scales. There's 10 main. There's hypochondriasis as number 1, then depression, hysteria, antisocial, psychopathic. There's gender, there's paranoia, anxiety, obsessions, compulsions is scale 7, schizophrenia scale 8, scale 9, hypomania, and scale 0 is social introversion. So here are those scales again. If you have a score above T of 65, it's considered clinically significant. There's also content scales to get a better sense of the areas of concern and problems. Essential to the MMPI are validity scales, and the 3 you want to know about the most are the L, the lie scale, or wanting to present oneself in a L, favorable light, the F scale, which is faking bad, and the K scale, which indicates guardedness. Those are the most important to know. There are different kinds of codes when you do MMPI scoring, and you can do a profile analysis based on 2-point and 3-point codes. When an examinee answers true to all the items, the L and K scores are below 50 in the F scale, or the favorable light becomes high, very elevated. A V-shaped pattern of L, F, and K suggests that they've tried to fake good in general, and an extremely elevated F scale, or fake bad scale, could be about malingering. So what about some of these different codes? Well, you have the conversion V, which is 1, 2, and 3, and that's the neurotic triad. And then you have the psychotic V, or paranoid valley, and that scales 6, 7, and 8. The MMPI psychometric properties, this was standardized on thousands of people that were randomly selected. The validity has been questioned because some of the items of the scales overlap, and so a lot of the scales are highly correlated. And there are some differences in terms of ethnicity and such. This is an ipsative test based on Murray's 15 basic needs and only provides comparison of relative strengths. Cattell's 16 personality factor questionnaire is based on factor analysis and gives you 16 different traits. The NEO is the big 5, and this is based on extroversion, agreeableness, conscientiousness, neuroticism, and openness to experience. This was an theoretical lexical approach was used to create it, characteristics from a dictionary using factor analysis. The Myers-Briggs is based on the work of Carl Jung, and you have 4 different scales: introversion, extroversion, sensing, intuition, thinking, feeling, and judging, perceiving. And they can be combined and help people choose careers or majors and such things. The MCMI is used to diagnose on the DSM-4 for axis 1 and 2. It has personality disorder and clinical scales. So projective tests differ from these other ones, and their use says that if you give someone unstructured stimuli, you can get meaningful information. That's based on the projective hypothesis. The Rorschach inkblot test, there's 10 cards, and how you answer reflects conflicts. There's 2 stages of administration: free association and inquiry, and then you get scored in 5 or more different categories. This has actually been found to be more reliable and valid than people initially thought. The thematic apperception test is based as well on Murray's needs, and basically you can find out about from the person makes up a story, and you can find out about the intensity, frequency, and duration of needs, themes, outcomes. Okay, clinical assessment. There are a number of scales that you can use for clinical assessment. So neuropsychological assessments, these are used to diagnose neurological disorders, and they're often comprehensive batteries. So the batteries are the Halstead-Rayton and the Luria, Nebraska. The Halstead-Rayton is for brain damage, where it is and the severity of it. The index is from 0 to 1, and the higher you get, the worse it is. And then there's also individual tests that measure specific aspects, and then you can see if something more thorough is needed. The Bender-Gestalt is a visual motor integration screen for neurological impairment. There are 16 stimulus cards. First you copy, and then you draw them from memory. The Benton Visual Retention Test is used to assess for visual memory, perception, and motor skills, and this can help you identify brain damage in those that are 8 or older. The Bury-Butenica is used to assess visual motor integration skills, increasingly difficult geometric figures that the examinee copies, birth to elementary school age. Wisconsin card, this assesses your ability to form abstract concepts and shift cognitive strategies. This will help identify frontal lobe damage, as well as alcoholism, autism, schizophrenia, depression, and malingering. The Stroop color word test rests upon your ability to suppress a habitual response, and this ends up measuring cognitive flexibility, selective attention, and response inhibition. The Tower of London is a variation of the Tower of Hanoi puzzles, and this has been linked to things like ADHD, autism, and depression. The Wechsler memory scale, this is a pretty important one, and this can be used for all aspects of memory. The brief cognitive status subtest can screen for cognitive impairment. The mini mental status exam is usually used to screen for cognitive impairment in older adults. There are 6 aspects of functioning, including immediate recall, attention, delayed recall, language, visual ability, and if you're also oriented. So basic cognitive functioning, scoring from 0 to 30, 23 to 24 is usually the cutoff. The Glasgow Coma Scale. This is used to assess level of consciousness following a brain injury. The score can range from 3 to 15, and lower is more severe here. So the lower, the worse. 3 to 8 means you're in an unconscious state. The Rancho Scale, this is a measure of cognitive recovery during the first 2 weeks to months following a head injury. There are about 14 different levels. 10 different levels. So what happens when you want to assess for depression and suicide? Well, the Beck Depression Inventory is the go-to with 21 items. The lower, the less depressed. And when assessing for ADHD, there are a number of different scales that you can use, broadband and narrowband scales. Those are used for detailed information. Broad scale is like the Connors, and that's kind of distinguish it from other disorders in general. In terms of assessing for autism, there are a number of different scales that can be used. Some have been covered. One thing to note is autism kids tend to find embedded figures faster than peers without that disorder. And how do you assess for what's now intellectual disability? This is important, and it is required from the Individual Disabilities Education Act to be evaluated regularly from 0 to 21 years. You have to have the least restrictive IEP possible that is parent approved. An IQ test can't determine special needs. Now, that was based on a case of Larry P. versus Riles, where IQ tests were found to be biased and discriminated against Black children. So therefore, you can't make those calls on IQ tests anymore. The Vineland scale is for the purpose of personal and social skills for brain development issues, and can help in the development of treatment plans and IEPs and such things. The Intellectual Disability Scale. This assesses 5 different areas of adaptive functioning and is designed for ages 3 to 18. An assessment for malingering, finally. There's a lot of ways to do that if tests and subtests are inconsistent, and their MMPI too has validity scales that will detect that to some degree.